Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mariela Salinas, and I am a digital marketing specialist here at United Training. Welcome to today's webinar, 5 Tips in 20 Minutes, Pivot Tables in Microsoft Excel, presented by Joseph Christian. We are using the GoToWebinar platform for today's session, and we will be sharing a copy of this recording with you. We do encourage participation throughout the webinar, so please use the questions option in your GoToWebinar dashboard for our Q&A portion after the presentation. United Training is excited to present this webinar today. I'll now hand it over to you, Joseph.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So welcome, everyone. We are talking about pivot tables today. I've put together 5 tips for people who work with pivot tables that I think will be really helpful. Some of these you might already be aware of, some you might not. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at these. We're going to assume that everyone has kind of a basic understanding of pivot tables, that you use them already, at least to some capacity. Even if you don't create them, maybe someone else made it, but we want to be able to go in and play around in pivot tables and really have a little bit more control over what we're looking at and how we look at it. I know that pivot tables can be really intimidating. Sometimes you only know how to do a specific thing in a pivot table. You know, like, that's all I do. I don't really know how to do anything else. I don't want to mess anything up, right? So the first thing that we're going to look at here with pivot tables is working with number formats and how to show and summarize values. And that might sound like a lot, but there's different ways that we can look at our data in a pivot table. So let's go ahead and pull up a pivot table here. Now I've got a really basic pivot table here set up for us, okay? And what this is, notice we've got it organized by regions and years. Then we've got this grand total, okay? And I'll just show you real quick the data I pulled this from. So we've got a list of our clients. So let's say we're selling these products for our company. We work with all these other companies, okay? And it's pulling all of this data into our pivot table. And of course, over here on the right, you can see which items we're working with. So it's our total sales. That's what these total numbers are. Notice with the total numbers, they don't have a format connected to them. We're not seeing dollar signs. We're not seeing commas. Sometimes we're seeing 3 decimal places. And one of the questions I get with pivot tables is, how do I change that formatting for the whole pivot table, as opposed to trying to change it one at a time? Because often when you create your pivot table, it loses that formatting. So the first thing I want to show you is the number format. And the beauty of this is, in a pivot table, all you have to do is right-click on any one of those numbers in the pivot table. So notice I'm right-clicking on a number, and I can go to number format. Now we might want to go to format cells. That's usually what we would do outside of a pivot table. But we're going to go to number format so that it makes the change for all of the numbers in the pivot table. So let's say we want dollar signs. So we right-click on a number, go to number format. Once we select number format, now it's going to take us into our little format window where I can come down and we'll just set it in here to currency. And we can, let's say we don't want the decimal places, so we can bring those down, okay? And then press OK. And see how it makes that change for all of the numbers. So we didn't have to select them all, because that can be an issue because things are always kind of moving around in the pivot table. So you right-click on a number once and make that change. Also notice when we right-click on a number that we have options for summarize values by and show values as. These are 2 other ways that we can change the way we see the data in our pivot table. So for instance, let's say instead of the total sales, we wanted to see average sales. Well, we could right-click on a number, come down to summarize values by, and change it to average. And that's going to switch those numbers over to averages rather than the totals. If we want to switch it back or change it to something else, again, right-click on one of those numbers, go to summarize values by, and make that choice. So I'll switch it back to sum. Now, what about when we right-click on a number and go to show values as? This will actually give us other options, many of which are percentages. So let's say we wanted a percentage breakdown for our regions here. okay? We could do show values as percentage of column total. And now you'll see that we get this percentage breakdown, each leading up to 100%. This can make it a lot easier when you're dealing with a lot of numbers or large numbers, and you're trying to see where are we at with this, which one's higher, how much percent. Go in there, right click on a number, show values as, and make that choice in there, okay? And you'll see if I expand one of these items, we're gonna get that percentage breakdown in here for all of those sub items as well. So if you do have breakdown like this, where I have a region and then multiple states underneath it, you'll get that percentage in there for those. Then again, to switch it back, we just right click on a number, go to show values as, and this time I'm gonna come up and say no calculation. That'll switch it right back around for me, okay? So that is going through and working with the number format and then showing and summarizing values. Again, just right click on the cell and then choose one of those options. Next, we're going to take a look at grouping fields and dates. And I think this can be a really helpful, important thing to be able to do. When you're working in a pivot table, you might want to group them, the data that you have, in certain ways. So first, let's talk about how to create a group that doesn't already exist. Now, there's already a breakdown here by region, right? Midwest, Northeast, etc. But those were based on the columns from my original data. Let's say that I want to group together all of the West and all of the East. I want two different groups for those. Now, of course, you could go back over to your original data, make those changes, refresh the pivot table. But if you don't need that information in the original data, we can just make that change right here in the pivot table. It's pretty simple and easy to do. So let me show you here. First, let's group together all of the East options, because those are right next to each other here. So what I'm going to do is simply click and drag to select both of those two fields that I want to group together. So I've selected Northeast and Southeast. Once I have them selected, we're going to right click on that group, and then I'm going to select group, okay? So you select the items that you want to group together. We're going to kind of lump them together here. We right click on the selection and then click on group. Once we click on group, it automatically creates a group to group them together. You see I've got group one. Now let's group together the West options. So I'm going to select all of those. So I'm going to click on Midwest, hold down Shift to select the Southwest and West. Once I have those selected, I can right click on those and again, click on group. Once I click on group, it's going to group them together. So now I've got group one, group two. If you have a lot of groups, that can get really confusing. So you want to rename them, right? So I can just click on group two and type in West and press enter, click on group one and type in East and press enter. And there we go. Now we've got them grouped together and I can collapse those. So now I can look at my numbers for just the East and the West, or of course I can expand them to pull them right back out again. Okay, so that's a way that we can create a group. And you can also ungroup them. If you right click on a group you've created, you'll see the ungroup option and you can ungroup them. Sometimes grouping happens automatically. Notice that for my columns, we have these years up here at the top, 2016 and 2017. So if you grab a date, the date that we're working with is the shipped date. And when I put shipped date into my columns, it automatically broke those out and kind of grouped them together based on years. Notice if I click my plus sign for 2017, I've got quarter one. If I click my plus sign for 2016, I've got quarters 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then I can click the plus signs for those. So it actually breaks it down for me here, year, then quarter, then month, which can be helpful, or maybe I don't want them grouped that way. So you can actually change groups if they happen automatically, which again usually happens with dates like this. So let's say that I don't want quarters. I want to be able to expand 2016 and I just want to see all of the months. I'm not worried about quarters in there. So what I'm going to do is right click on one of those years, doesn't matter which one. I'm going to right click on one of them here. So I right click on 2016 and then when it come down to group, I could ungroup them, but I still want some of the grouping, right? So I'm going to click on group and notice it's already grouping based on month, quarter, and year. So I'm just going to deselect quarters by clicking on it. So the blue is what it's going to be grouped by. So it's grouped now by months and years. So now when I press OK, there we go. I can expand 2016 to see the months, but I'm no longer seeing the quarters in there. Okay, same thing is true here for 2017, which I just have some stuff in January there. So again, right click on the date, select group, and then you can go in and kind of pick and choose how you want those dates grouped. So if I want quarters back, I'll click on quarters, press OK, and now the quarters are going to be back in there for those. Okay, so that's how we go through and work with grouping fields and dates. You just right click on the cell, select group or select ungroup, and then you can kind of go from there. And that can really help us to organize our data, especially when you are working with a lot. All right, next we're going to talk about auto fitting the column widths on update. And when we say update, we mean anytime you do a new filter, make a change, the pivot table changes your column widths. This is a big question I get often, is how do I make this stop? Because if you work with pivot tables, you might have noticed every time you're doing a filter, making a change, your column width, your pivot table could be huge, suddenly it's small, now it's big, kind of moving around. You don't have to leave it like that, okay? We can go in and we can tell Excel, hey, I'm going to be in control of my column widths and don't mess with them, okay? So when we right click on a cell in our pivot table, we are going to see the option for pivot table options. Okay, so when I right click on a cell, I'm going to see down here close to the bottom of that list, pivot table options. This is going to be an important one to be able to go through because you can change some of the defaults. Okay, so I right click on a number, and when I go to pivot table options, it pulls up this little options window. You can make all sorts of changes in here. The one that we are talking about is the auto fit column widths. So down here where this checkbox says auto fit column widths on update, I would simply uncheck that box and press OK. And now I can choose how my columns go, where everything is. And when I filter and make changes, the column widths will stay as they are. You can always go back in there and turn that back on again if you do want it to start automatically changing those column widths. So this can be really helpful if you want to format your pivot table, or maybe you have to present your pivot table at a meeting or something. You want to make sure that it's laid out a certain way. Okay, so that can be a great way to help you kind of keep control of that formatting. Auto fit column widths on update. Again, right click on one of the cells in the pivot table and then go to pivot table options. All right, next one we're going to look at tip number 4 here, repeating all item labels. What is that? What are we talking about here? Well, let's take a look at our pivot table. Again, this is a question that I get a lot when I'm teaching pivot tables, is how on earth do I get labels to go all the way across? And I'll show you what I mean here. Okay, let's expand some of these items out here. So I'm going to kind of expand some of these fields in here. There we go. Notice, for instance, when I'm looking at the Midwest, I don't see the label Midwest to the left of all of these states. So if you're working with a pivot table that has a lot of data in it, as you're going through and kind of scrolling through, I might be thinking, well, what region is this? I can't tell what this region is because I don't have my label over here on the left. And I think it's a little bit tricky the way that Excel has it set up to turn on those labels. But if those labels are something you want, or if you just want to play around with how you look at your data in here in Excel, what we're going to do is we're going to come up to our design tab up here at the top in the ribbon. Now, if you don't see a design tab up here, that might be because you're not clicked into your pivot table. So when I clicked outside of my pivot table, you might notice my design tab is now disappeared. It's gone, right? And that can make you panic. It's like, oh no, where'd my tab go? I lost all my fields over here on the right as well, right? If you've ever run into that. So you want to make sure you're clicked in your pivot table. When I click back into my pivot table, now I see I've got the design tab up here at the top. So it's a tab specifically designed for the pivot table here. So I click on the design tab, and this is going to help me design my pivot table. It can be really helpful to come up here and see some of the different options. You can change colors, you can change whether or not you're seeing totals, where the totals are, that kind of thing. What we're concerned with is our labels here, okay? So we clicked on the design tab, and we're going to come over to this layout group. And I'll show you why I think it's a little bit tricky to set up. Because if you click around in some of these, you might have stumbled upon it. It's under the report layout dropdown. So when I click on report layout, there's an option to repeat all item labels. That's what we want. But if you just click on that, looks like nothing happened. Why? Why isn't it doing anything? Well, it's not doing anything because I haven't changed it, the layout out of compact form. Notice on the report layout dropdown, and it's confusing too because it doesn't indicate for you which one is on. So I'm looking at this, I'm like, I have no idea what any of this means because I can't tell which one's on or off. But I'll tell you, okay, you're in the know with Joe here, that the default is to show in compact form and to not repeat item labels. And we want to make a change to both of those. So from the report layout dropdown, and I'll switch it back to its default here so we can get an idea. So I'm going to come in and change it out of compact form. You can do outline form or you can do tabular form. They're similar, but both of them are going to make it possible to repeat those item labels. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do tabular form. So report layout dropdown, showing tabular form. Now, and you can see what it does here, right? Gives me a whole column in here for those regions. So now I can go to the report layout dropdown and say repeat all item labels. And now when I select that, I'm going to get all of those item labels right in there. Okay. And I'll show you here, outline form changes it up a little bit, kind of moves things around, but still both of those options will let you repeat those. If I go back to compact form, I'm going to lose them because it puts everything into one column. It's not giving an extra column for those items. So if you want to repeat all item labels, go ahead and turn that one on, but then make sure you're switching out of compact form. So either to outline or to tabular form so that you can see those item labels in there. Okay, so I get that question a lot because it's like, I've got this big pivot table. How do I find those items, right? All right, so that's repeating all item labels. Go to the design tab and then report layout options in there. Our last tip is working with filters. Filters, slicers, and timelines. Now, you might already be aware of the basic filters available in a pivot table. For instance, let's say I want to filter down by company, but I don't have company name in here as a column. So I can come over to my fields and I can drag company into the filters group, right? I can grab company and drag it right into filters, and I get that extra company filter above my pivot table. So it gives me that extra filter, and you can do a bunch of those, right? And just kind of throw them in this filter group. And that can be a really great way to be able to filter down to different items in your pivot table. Obviously, we have the built-in filters, right? Those are the drop-down arrows we get in the pivot table, but you can add more based on other fields by dragging them into the filter group. And there's two other ways we can filter as well. And this is going to be in our pivot table analyze tab up in the ribbon. Again, make sure you're clicked in your pivot table, come up to pivot table analyze. And when you click on that tab, in the filter group, you'll see you have insert slicer and insert timeline. So if I do insert slicer, let's say that I want another filter for sales representatives, okay? So I'm gonna click on insert slicer and I'm gonna choose sales rep and press okay. And it pops up with a slicer. And now I can filter down. It's the same thing as a filter, but it's more dynamic. If I want to look at Anderson's numbers, I can click on Anderson and it immediately filters down to Anderson. If I want to look at Cooper, I click on Cooper, filters me down to Cooper's numbers. You can do more than one at a time by holding down Control as you click on them. And then you can clear it out by clicking this red X. This is such a great, quick, dynamic way to filter back and forth. It's not great for large lists. Notice my sales reps isn't a super long list. So for something like the company names, right, a lot of companies, the traditional dropdown can be good, but slicers can be great for shorter lists. And then we also had timelines as well. So if I insert a timeline, that's going to be kind of like the slicer, but it's based on dates. And you can click around to certain months, you can change it back and forth between quarters and years, etc. So really great kind of extra ways that we can filter. All right, so again, those are filters, slicers, and timelines. Pivot table analyze tab and then go over to filter. And that is it for our 5 tips in here today. Hopefully some of those have been helpful for you. Any questions that you have in here? I'll go ahead and pull up that. Any questions?
Alrighty, looks like we have one question here. And again, if anybody has any questions, go ahead and use that questions option in your GoToWebinar dashboard. First question we have here from Sheila is in reference to the first tip, if I do not show any of the options when I right click on a number as the instructor, is there a way to turn that feature on?
Interesting question. I'm not sure. You should see options when you right click on a number, at least some of these in here. But I will say, if right clicking doesn't work for you, or maybe some people are on a Mac, I don't know Macs and how, some of the things might be different in there. If those don't work, trying to right click on the number, those things aren't popping up. I would suggest as an alternative to come over to your field list, which is over here on the right, and click on the drop down menus in your field list, okay? Because notice I was right clicking and you'll see things in there, value field settings and things like that. You can get to those often from the drop down menus over here. It just might take a couple more clicks. So if you go to your drop down, for instance, under values and go to value field settings, this will let you go in and change the number format and things like that in there as well. Okay, so you can try those drop downs menus also.
Awesome. Alrighty, and we have another question here from Laura. How do you change format currency for just one column in the pivot and not all columns?
That's a good question because it usually does default to going through and doing all of the all of the columns in there as once. Usually what I will do, I'm not sure if there's a quick way to go through and do that. Let me pull this back over here a little bit. Because if you select them, I believe it will still go through and make that change in there for those. So in that case, I guess you would probably want to do format cells. Remember I said to do number format, and that was because it's going to do all of them at once. But if I just wanted to say, let's say I just wanted to switch these over to get rid of the dollar signs, let's say. If I right click and go to format cells and take them over to number and press OK, it's just going to change those. So that's a really good point to bring up. If you wanted to do it to all of them, that's why we were doing number format. We just right clicked on one and it switched that to all of them. But if you just want to make a switch to certain cells, like a column, for instance, in that case, you want to select those items, right click, and then do format cells, just like you normally would outside of a pivot table.
Perfect. And we have another one here from Fang. How do you avoid the blank column or row?
Good question. So that's going to be up here in our design tab. When you come up to your design tab up here, there's a blank rows drop down. Okay, so you can work with your blank rows right in here. Notice it says insert blank line after each item, remove blank line after each item. So you can play around with those blank rows right in there in the design tab.
So another question here from Sharon. It seems the slicer and timeline features are also available in Power BI. When is it good to use an Excel pivot table instead of Power BI?
I don't know that there's necessarily there's not like a hard and fast rule on when to use one or the other. Power BI might have some extra features that are a little bit different from Excel. So other than just if you've already got one set up, I would say just keep it as it is. You don't have to switch over. It's just when you run into differences, you say, oh, Power BI can do something Excel can, or Excel has something I don't want. So there's unfortunately not a hard and fast rule. It's just whenever one is no longer up to par with what you need in there. I mean, the same is true in Access. Access can do a lot of the things that we can do in Excel. So it's just a matter of, can you get it done in one, or does one of the others have features that you're missing in that one?
Perfect. Awesome. And I believe that was the last question. We did have a question about having sample files. I will work on that for you guys if that's something that you want. But other than that, I think those are all of our questions. So thank you so much, Joseph. This was a lot of
Thank you so
amazing
much.
information. And again, we will be sharing this recording with all of you in an email after the webinar. So thanks again, everyone, for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.